Welcome to F4 Talks. With me is Glenn Cole. He's just written an editorial for Newsweek, and that is about the Trump administration, Trump 2.0, introducing firings or voluntary retirements or golden parachutes to the CIA. And today, the topic is Donald Trump 2.0, are lunatics now running the asylum? Glenn, welcome.
Thank you. Hello again.
So, Glenn, we have Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense. He's just said that Ukraine will not be able to join NATO. He said that Ukraine will lose part of its territory. We've had US President Donald Trump say that Volodymyr Zelensky is a dictator. We've had Tulsi Gabbard confirmed as Director of National Intelligence. I'm sure you're pleased. You're an ex-CIA man after all. We've had Kash Patel confirmed as Director of FBI. It is a brave new world, isn't it?
Well, you know, I guess the working title or the title of our talk is Are the Lunatics Running the Asylum or something to that effect. I think that is probably being too kind, actually, because a lunatic is not necessarily malevolent or duplicitous. And the remarkable thing about the whole Trump phenomenon is actually how sincere so many of the people who support him are in their beliefs. Polls have shown for years, it's no surprise, except that it's shocking when they come to have power, but polls show that 40% of Americans are not concerned with, don't care about democracy, which also implies the rule of law, really. They express a preference for a strongman leader who will, quote, get things done, irrespective of the law or social convention or separation of powers or any other element. Every society has these elements, people who are not politically engaged or are, but actually are authoritarians. And for most people, politics is a distant thing that gets in the way because the town hasn't filled in the pothole on the street that you drive on, or the school has too large a classroom, or the taxes that you pay are a burden. And that's, frankly, almost as far as most people's interests go. So 10 years ago, when Trump first became, or more actually, a national political figure instead of sort of this media celebrity, I did expect, and I believe I wrote and said, sure I said, that people who said, oh, don't worry about it, the general activists, the politicians, Republicans in this instance, or public members of the public will not go along with such crazy things. And I said that no, instantaneously I've experienced this, that people of goodwill, half of of whatever population group we're talking about, will instantaneously go along with their leader. And that's exactly what I experienced with regard to torture, frankly, in the CIA. People I knew to be honorable people said, well, our bosses said that it's okay. So it's okay because our system is fundamentally good. We're the good guys, and therefore what we do is okay. And sounds sort of spotty reasoning, but that's what I saw, and they were quite sincere. So I haven't been surprised at all.
Glenn, that's the story of human history. Too many good people served Joseph Stalin. Too many people served Indira Gandhi, even during the emergency. You will meet so many people in India, nice people, writing the civil services exam to become Indian administrative service officers, Indian some may want to become Indian police service or Indian foreign service too. But the system is colonial. The privileges are feudal. People just go along with whatever the status quo happens to be and whatever the system their ancestors bequeathed to them or their conquerors bequeathed to them. That's just human nature, really. So what's new?
Right. There isn't anything new. I think for some Americans, it is a revelation. For most of my life, I'm a little older than you. I'm happy you say I'm not old, but I actually am actuarially. I am old. Um, but for really all my life, because I was born in the decade after World War II ended, only 10 years after, the default assumption. It was sort of a thumbnail way of thinking of people and societies. Was that, oh, of course, the Germans are intrinsically different. Look what they did. They incinerated 6 million Jews. How awful. We would never do that. Of course not. We're moral, good people, dedicated to the rule of law, and so on. Well, that was blind at the time, and it's simply wrong. When you are a average German citizen and you're put into the military and you're put at a guard post and you're told anyone who comes out you have to shoot, anyone who goes in you have to shoot, if you don't then we will shoot you. What do you do? And if that guard post happens to be the gate of Dachausen, then you are complicit in mass murder. But if you don't do it, and this is sort of the Nuremberg defense, which is not accepted, that they were following orders. If you don't do it, you are destroyed as an individual. And one individual can essentially do almost always nothing against the forces of society and the government and larger currents. And so most people keep their heads down, and that's not necessarily a cruel or complicit, willfully complicit behavior, but it's in many ways the helplessness of an individual in the course of history in social movements and politics. But as I said, I saw instantaneously half of the population of my cohort sincerely switch their positions instantaneously. So let me get this back to the specific question at hand. I think this is the context that things are happening. So are they lunatics? Are they fellow travelers? Are they people keeping their heads down? Are they deluded? Or are they evil, depending on evil? I think the evil is someone willfully taking an action that that causes harm to others for personal advantage that could be avoided. I think that's sort of the definition of evil to me. So my answer about all these people is there is a combination for the figures we're discussing, Gabbard, Patel, Hegseth, of true belief, personal ambition, lack of principle, and then different philosophy. In the case of, I would say, Gabbard, at least, and Trump, as I've said for a decade, there's strong evidence that they have been affected, at the very least, by the tropes and manipulations of Russian intelligence. They obviously have reacted strongly against that. Donald Trump has. But the evidence is of contacts by the Russians is overwhelming. So, and when his statements don't just echo, but actually repeat verbatim the talking points of the Russian Foreign Ministry, the Kremlin, and the Russian intelligence service, one should take note. And I ask all of our listeners, have any of you ever in your lives met one individual who agrees with every position that you have, every political view that you have? And the answer will be no. I don't think there's anyone I have met in my 68 years who agrees with me on everything. It simply is not possible on every single thing. So when there is perfect correlation between the statements of certain public figures with that of the Russian line, one should take note. So are they lunatics? I think actually some of them, Patel does believe most of what he says, but there's also hucksterism, expediency, personal ambition, disregard for democracy, and serving the master, which is another element which is profoundly important in this moment. How humans are tribal, and even without being aware of it, will align themselves with the person whom they view as the leader of their tribe. So lunatics, yes and no.
Now, you wrote in your latest piece, The Ghost of Hitler's Lawyer, and you talk about John Radcliffe, you talk about buyouts to the entire CIA workforce. And of course, you mentioned the CIA has been inconvenient for many presidents since 1947. Indeed, I'm sure the new conservatives under George Bush Jr. weren't exactly in love with the CIA. What's going on here? What's going on with DOGE, DOGE, Department of
Yeah,
Governmental Efficiency, led by the great Elon Musk, whose car you drive?
I do not. My wife does.
Okay,
My
well,
family
okay.
does.
Well, your wife does anyway. It's in the family. So my question is simple. What's really going on here? And what are the implications of this forest fire?
Uh, where to begin? Well, first, uh, the seeds of this go of what's happening are not directly attributable to Trump. Trump is an agent of this movement, but they go far, far further back in time. When I was on the National Intelligence Council, of course, I met with all different aspects of the government and elements of the government, and we directly served the president, the White House. So we frequently met with our colleagues there and the office of the vice president and the Pentagon. And during a break of one meeting, uh, you have coffee and you chit chat and so on. This is all standard. And I was chatting with one of the staffers from the Secretary of Defense. I think that's right. And I said, characteristically naive, or at least false, disingenuously naive, but perhaps both at the same time. I said, more or less, I, I'd like to tell you that we're on the same side, and yet you treat us as though we are an enemy. And I said it using that term, which is not a very diplomatic term, in a lighthearted way, so as to show that I was trying to be collegial, to dare to say something, which of course then I'm implicitly exaggerating for effect, although I wasn't exaggerating at all. And the fellow looked at me with a truly an angry, hateful expression. And he said, no joke whatsoever, he said, "You are the enemy." Now, the "you" was the National Intelligence Council and the CIA, for the reasons that you just touched upon, that I write about in my article, which is that by design, the objective, the purpose of the CIA is to provide, and the intelligence community is to provide independent, objective analysis. And by so doing, you serve the president, the executive. You don't serve the president by parroting what he says. And of course, that is always um, a problem, well, always frequently a problem for the White House if their ideology and their political interpretations differ from what the intelligence community believes are the facts. That was the case. There are a number of examples. In Vietnam, the CIA, for long before the United States committed substantial numbers of troops, said it's committing troops will not be a success. We are not. And then when the war was waging, the successes being claimed by various commanders are not in line with the facts as we see them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, that was viewed as not just a problem, but working for the enemy almost. That was certainly the case, that dynamic, when I was working. My time was during the end of the Cold War, during the War on Terror, during the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, issues in Europe and the Middle East. And we consistently said that the assessment of Al-Qaeda was not correct. The assessment of weapons of mass destruction was not correct. And we can go, I won't go into all the weeds. I could, because that's what I live. But the point is that the agency and the intelligence community have always been a thorn, but by design. So what's happening here is partly the traditional efforts by the chief executive to bring the CIA under its control so that it is not a problem. Part of it is a vendetta by Trump, because a friend of mine, someone I admire greatly, former director of the CIA, John Brennan, and others, James Clapper, who is director of national intelligence, and on and on. General Hayden, who was director of the NSA and then of the CIA, for whom I worked some, and of whom I think very highly, also said essentially the Russian connections are alarming, need to be looked into. The Russians are doing X, Y, and Z. From the FBI's angle, the Hunter Biden laptop issue is not as it was characterized by the Republicans. And for Trump and Republicans, those positions are at odds with their views, but those are the facts. So what they have done is to try to begin to clean house and eliminate anyone who does not follow the Trump line. What differs this time from other efforts by previous presidents is that this is also part of a twofold framework of much deeper import and danger. And they are first the belief by the conservative Republicans and Trump, who sort of adopted this, in the deep state, and that it and to try to destroy the quote deep state unquote. And then two, part of a long-term Republican effort to reduce the size, the absolute size of the federal government of the United States by 50%. Both of those efforts are defining the offer of furloughs and to every CIA employee in the world to reduce the size of the institution, bring it under control, attack the hostility of the deep state, which we will, I'm sure, talk about what that means, and reduce the size of the federal government so that it conducts the traditional theory of this has been that the national government should only have worry about national defense and control of the border. That's all. That's all. And thus people at the National Institutes of Health, or you choose, what else, are all doing things that are proof of Marxism. And the last thing I'll say before you go on is, if any of the readers have not read Project 2025, they may wish to, because it is, and here your title of our talk is right on the line. It says things that are frankly lunatic, that are profoundly dangerous, that are untrue, not just debatable, untrue. But once you accept a certain point, you believe it, then the reasoning tree branches out, and the entire reasoning tree is based on lies, and so you'll have distorted growth of your perceptions. And that's frankly what's happened. Now they'll say, "Oh, Carl is the partisan Democrat. Of course, he's going to say that he's part of the deep state, et cetera, blah blah blah." Well, we could go over the infinite number of facts. The problem is that, what was it Mark Twain said? Rumors circle the world before you can get a fact out of your mouth, or something to that effect.
So give me one example where Project 2025 is lying.
Is lying.
Yeah, lying.
It says that civil
Wrong on the facts.
servants. This is a paraphrase, but multiple times it's in the foreword, but also within the actual recommendations in the text. Civil servants are dedicated cultural Marxists and are undermining democracy. That bureaucracies are proof of totalitarianism and don't represent the people, and that the only way to represent the people is to eliminate all of them.
Splendid. So, uh, civil servants are culturally Marxist. Well, that may be true for some of you, and that's the Republican argument one hears all the time, is that nearly all federal government employees are loyal not to the USA, but to the Democratic Party. And the CIA is full of Democrats who don't like Republicans. And actually, you mentioned it in your article, this goes back to Ronald Reagan years. The then director ran his own private intelligence agency within the CIA.
Mm-hmm. That is true. Conservatives are challenged with the truth on the whole. No, it's the other way around, of course. But we could choose almost randomly a public issue, and I can substantiate what I'm saying, and then will be denounced, of course, as a partisan. Actually, the political culture of the CIA is pretty accurate, pretty faithfully representative of the spectrum of American society. So you do have, I always used to say, and I think I was proven wrong in one part of the statement, that you would find everything from borderline Marxists to borderline fascists. And I found actually that was wrong on one end of the scale. The Marxists who I became aware of were probably actually working for the Russians, the very few. But there were more extreme right nationalists in the agency than I had thought. But nonetheless, on the whole, it's pretty well representative of American society. The difference of the CIA standard deviations of belief on issues from those of the leading Republican leaders are because facts tend to skew to the assessments of the center or the center left, which is viewed by definition as hostile to Republicans, which is not true. It's not true. It's an affirmation of seeking objective facts. So that would be the case on support for the far right in Israel, as opposed to a more centrist coalition in favor of a two-state solution. That would be the supposed explanation for why almost all foreign policy experts in the CIA or the State Department or other parts of the foreign policy establishment in the U.S. Have viewed Hamas as hideous, but making a two-state solution not possible also as a dead end that can only end in failure. And that conflicts with the Republican view of supporting essentially the right-wing positions of the Israeli spectrum. That is viewed then as biased and Marxist. It's not.
Surely we'll have a Trump hotel in Gaza. The Gazans will move to the Sinai Desert, some maybe to Jordan, and there'll be peace and kumbaya.
Of course, that's right. Yes. Yeah.
So let's talk about this constant chatter about the deep state. It's very popular. A lot of people use it. There seems to be an element of truth to it, but let's hear from the man who was in the belly of the
The deep state
beast.
representative.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what is the deep state? The term generally is viewed to have come from Turkey in the late 1990s as political Islam and Erdogan and his movement were rising and challenging secular Turkey, the Kemalist Turkey. They said, well, they're burrowed into the institutions of government are elements that are hostile to us and actively working against us. They are the deep state. Actually, the concept is a good deal older, and it's a fundamentally fascist interpretation of social and political dynamics. In fascism, the government is viewed as oppressive, not representative of the people, exploitative of the people, and that the bureaucrats in it are coherent in their actions and working in favor of their own personal interests and against those of the people, and that the only way one can be safe from the government and impose the people's will or realize the people's will is through a single leader. And the leader will attack and challenge the quote deep state. And we saw what that led to. That led to Mussolini and Hitler and 80 million dead around the world, and also the militarists in Tokyo to, one had thought for most of my life, address that particular perspective and put it to bed, to rest. But that's not what is now happening. It is resurgent. And it's resurgent largely because of QAnon, and which truly is a lunatic and also quite cynical phenomenon, and has been embraced by Republicans. Now, the kernel of truth that you touched upon, and I agree with, is that two things happen. Any bureaucracy will do what the bureaucracy is sort of organized to do, and will be, at least to some extent, recalcitrant from any change. So that is true, but that's not coherent. It's not as though I sitting in the CIA and John Smith sitting in the FBI and Mary Jones sitting in the National Security Agency and somebody else sitting in the Internal Revenue Service get together, collude, and plot how to defeat the people, exploit the people, and defeat the representatives who are trying to express the people's will and needs. That's not true. There's bureaucratic interests and lethargy. And because there is a range of views in any institution, some people will agree with political instructions and some will not. And those who don't will put the instructions at the bottom of their inbox. This is classic bureaucracy at work. And that's frustrating for any executive and in the White House. So that's one thing that's happening. The second,
if I can quickly interject, in former colonies, bureaucrats are immensely powerful, as we've seen in our travels, and often do not listen to elected representatives, particularly because they control districts, they control budgets. They are orders of magnitude more powerful than, say, Sir Humphrey Appleby in Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. So what you're saying about bureaucracy particularly applies to former colonies, which do not have a long tradition of self-governance, institutions, civil society, and initiative. There's too much learned helplessness. Over to you, sir.
That's a good expression. They're a sad expression, but an important one. So then the second thing that's happening, or another thing anyway, that leads to underlays the hostility to the bureaucracies, the institutions, and to the characterization of deep state evil is that their issues are complex in post-industrial, highly educated, internationally integrated, socially diverse societies. So the representatives of the people at the town level, the state level, and the federal, national level will say, well, we need to do something about air pollution because X number of people are dying from various ills caused by air pollution every year. And so we like people not to die. And so the experts say, well, if you cut car emissions, then fewer people will die. And so that's a good thing. And people decide, well, that's a good thing. And a law is passed, okay, we'll regulate tailpipe emissions for automobiles. And then someone has to make sure that tailpipe emissions are being following the new regulation agreed upon by the representatives of the people based on expert advice. So then a civil servant is told, walk around and measure tailpipes. And if a tailpipe exceeds something or other, issue a ticket. And people who get tickets will not like it. But that's the law. Okay. But then there's another law. And then there's another law, another regulation, and so on. And life becomes complex in how one meets all these obligations, each of which has been decided and agreed upon as in the public interest. However, it's always burdensome for some to have to conform to these obligations. And if I'm a producer of gasoline that is not in as clean as it needs to be, or not as clean as someone else can produce it, I'm in a bad situation, and it's because of this regulation. So the slow increasing burdens of regulation executed by civil servants are onerous to increasing numbers of people, although the common mutual benefits are increasing too. So what does one do? You can say, well, there's too much regulation, and the net benefit we're deriving from too much of this is less than the increased burden. And so then you try to eliminate the regulation, and that's hard to do, but you can reduce the budget or the personnel or change the regulations. Or a simpler thing to do is to find a bad guy, someone who is evil and in your way, and it's Glenn Carl, the man with the tailpipe measuring stick or whatever it is device. And you view him as hostile to your interests. And who appointed you, Glenn Carl? Well, who appointed me was actually you, by saying we would like to not die from air pollution in this instance. And that's it. But the simplistic, the simplest explanation is always the easiest one to grasp. And people, for these other reasons I at least partially touched upon, have created this view of hostility and evil intent that needs to be excised. It's not very profoundly thought through. It is insidious, it is fascistic, and it is self-harming.
So let's go back to regulations. You've talked about the thickening of processes in Europe. It's happened in the US too. And there are times when bureaucrats do lose a sense of balance. They go a bit too far. They're not receptive to democratic sentiment, and they become overbearing. We've given the example many a time during our videos of how hard it is to do business in Europe, that regulation destroys entrepreneurship. So, how do you find that balance? Because you could have excessive regulation with good intention, choking the economy, causing a lot of harm, creating all sorts of moral hazards and uh, flawed incentives. Or you could gut all the regulation and then the chemical factory can dump all its pollution in the river, internalize the profits and externalize the cost. So that how do you find that happy balance? And
Yeah.
is the reaction that we see today that supports Trump partly because for a while the Democrats lost their sense of balance? Is it just the pendulum swinging the other way?
Well, pendulum swings are, I think, normal process in this. I don't think we're living just that. However, we're living something much more insidious, dangerous, and profound. But you touch upon sort of the fundamental dilemma and challenge for any society, but certainly a democratic one. And I don't think there is not a single answer. Equilibrium is the hardest state. Um, Equilibrium is not an actual state of nature, really. The things resolve themselves one way or another. You can't be between gas and liquid, or maybe you can, but my high school physics and chemistry says that you can't really. An element, a substance will resolve itself to one or the other. So society has an infinite number, and therefore government has an infinite number of incompatible but equally laudable objectives. And the trying to find the balance in them is the great challenge for any public figure and any citizen, really. There's no question. I think everyone should agree, except for the true Marxist-Leninists, that too much regulation and government control stifles freedom, frankly, as well as hinders individual wealth growth and opportunities and so on. Just as the pure capitalism, unregulated in any way, leads to oligarchy, monopoly, exploitation, you use the expression which slips my mind now, exported costs or external, making exported costs or
Externalize the
something,
cost, internalize the profits.
externalizing the cost. Thank you. So it's an endless balance. I would argue, and I think most mainstream economists and political analysts would agree, that the U.S. found the happiest balance in human history from progressively from about 1933 to about 1980, a regulated market economy controlled by a democratic government. So you do have regulations, but you try to keep the regulations so unrestrictive that they don't stifle. But this is sort of the holy grail. No one's ever found it. It's impossible to reach this ideal state. One simply endlessly tries to balance and counterbalance and readjust. And the feeling, certainly among Republicans, but generally in American society, was that things had become too regulated. I think that was wrong, but that was certainly the feeling from about 1980 on. And some of these regulations started to be challenged, at least. And I think the Trump phenomenon is, to a large extent, not just on regulations, which are sort of a routine challenge for a modern society, but on the social changes that that are occurring and have occurred in American society that has stressed people's sense of belonging, if not certainty, at least comfort that there is a known way that it's accepted and how to be, and that one has lost control of one's own life. Yeah, I say this in many interviews and writing, but I think it's a central point almost. When I was born, America was 89% white. And then that was 1956. The other 11% essentially were Black Americans, with a small number of, in percentage terms, of what we now say are Native Americans, Indians. Not your kind of Indian; these are American Indians. But that was it. In 1965, the Civil Rights Act and Immigration Reform Act changed America forever by opening, for the first time in 50 years, the gates of immigration. So that probably in the next 5 years, I forget the exact date, But I think by 2030, certainly, America will no longer be 89% white, but it will be 49% white. Um, Diversity does many wonderful things, but change is stressful, and different cultures, each of which may be intrinsically as valid as the other in any regard, in their moral beliefs and their culinary practices, you choose whatever it is, the role of women, uh, nonetheless, are different from one another. And difference is a stress. And sociologists have found that any time in any society that a population becomes, the minority population in some society becomes greater than about 10%, that there is increasing social unrest. Now, it takes historically in America and everywhere, but America has been the only society in the modern era when the following has occurred. It takes 3 generations for immigrants to fully integrate to become America. It's the classic American story, which is the immigrant arrives from France, say, as my grandfather did, and he always will be a native French speaker. That's his native language. He spoke English. He spoke accentless English, but he was not a native English speaker. He was a French speaker. And culturally, he was French, even though he became American. His son, my father, was shaped by his parents so that he had different culinary and a few cultural and linguistic um, differences, if not quirks, from standard American practice. But he had largely integrated, and certainly these things are tales heard over the dinner table, but that had no direct effect on my sense of how I am as an American. This is the case with my wife, who comes from Asia. The classic pattern is 3. She's the second generation. Her mother came. She is astride 2 cultures, and her children are as American, quote unquote, as I am, fully integrated, so that the old country does not shape them powerfully anymore. That's what happens, but that is a stressful 75-year process. And people have said enough. The Chinese are selling cars. We can't sell cars anymore. I can't be a miner. I don't know how to do anything else because coal is not allowed because of these bloody regulations. And we're going to throw all the bums out. These guys who look like Glenn Carl go to fancy schools and walk around with tailpipe measuring sticks. And that's what's happening. But now it becomes far more insidious when there are allegations of collusion, evil intent, and illegal, corrupt practices by civil servants trying to implement their instructions as decided by the public representatives. But that's what's happening. And Gabbard, Hexeth, Radcliffe, and Patel, at their best, at the best that one can interpret them as being, are reacting against these phenomena. Their own pathologies and ambitions are much less admirable, I think, frankly.
All right. So we know that when a majority turns into a minority, we can expect some fireworks. In Germany, that may happen. We are starting to see 20% support for AfD or AfD, Allianz für Deutschland. My question for you is, can Doge work? Will it work? They are offering buyouts. Who will take it? And ultimately, will government function after the gutting of the civil service that actually runs Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, this whole belief that waste, fraud, and abuse, that's the standard Republican characterization, in the federal government is rampant. The great sociologist and political theoretician Elon Musk talks about hundreds of billions of dollars of waste, fraud, and abuse, and that's a standard Republican thing. I have many Republican friends who sincerely believe this. They're businessmen. They say government's inefficient. Look, it doesn't work for a profit. It loses money. It's a parasite on productive citizens and businesses, and let's get rid of it. That's a simple and compelling argument to make. But there's a fundamental difference between public services and profit-making private enterprises. Now, I don't think anyone who is sane argues against increasing efficiency and reducing waste. And this is one of the gray lines. One person's waste is another person's necessary act of social compassion, perhaps. However, certainly one can look at this. Having been my whole working life pretty much a civil servant in a non-profit making institution, and having worked with other civil servants in different bureaucracies, I can tell you there is not a vast amount of fraud. There truly is not. There are crooks everywhere, but the percentage of the expenditures and effort and personnel that go into this are simply not true. Take an old
Should have
hoary
joined the
line
Nigerian
from.
civil service. You were in the wrong
Well,
job. You should have joined the Nigerian civil service
yeah, well,
or the
okay.
Pakistani civil services or the Indian civil services. Any of the former colonies would have sufficed to leave you a fortune.
Well, the current administration is eliminating the regulatory offices within government agencies that spend their waking hours trying to ferret out and stop bribery uh, and kickbacks. This is literally true. So one can anticipate increases of waste fraud uh, because the agencies that in the position of the United States government arguing against having bribery and honoraria and so on as legal parts of doing international business deals uh, is being eliminated.
Well, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is
Yeah,
suspended.
yeah, yeah, which is crazy and
Why
dangerous.
crazy?
It will be harmful
Why
to
crazy?
Americans.
Wasn't
So
it a handicap for US companies to win business abroad? How would you
yeah, it can
win
be, and
business in
if
Nigeria without bribing the
sure,
strongman
no,
or
there's
Pakistan?
truth to that. The way it can actually succeed is if I worked or you worked for the government of Liechtenstein or Guatemala, say, we wouldn't have much enforcement capability. And the world is a nasty place where the strong can say, well, unless you line my pocket, you don't get to import Hyundais or whatever the hell. I'm not maligning Hyundai. Not at all. Um, but if you're the United States, then you can exact the cost. Now, this goes back to one of the fundamental points of international relations and political theory that people. Well, this has been my area of study, and I understand that the average person needn't have studied this, I suppose. But one of the fundamental points is that unless you have what we call a police power, some entity to enforce the law, then the law will be broken or ignored or undermined. So in a state, the police power literally is the police. And they say you can't drive 200 kilometers per hour on the highway because the odds of your killing other people's grandchildren and yourself is much higher. And we don't want you to kill anybody. So you have to drive no more than 150 kilometers an hour, whatever it is. There's no speed limit in Germany, I know, but forget that. That's another point to bring up to discuss. So we're going to regulate how people drive on city streets and the highways and so on. And if you ignore this regulation, this law, then we will punish you. Now, who does that? That is the police. That's the police power of the state. And because there's a threat of you being fined or having your license suspended, or having your car taken away, or being incarcerated, most people, most of the time, will follow that particular rule. But that's true for all rules. All without a police power, the laws will only be honored in the breach. So that is also true in international relations, and it is true in international economics. And this is the crisis of the world forever and internationally. Who is the police power? Well, there is no one agreed upon because the United Nations paralyzes itself through the veto power because China, Russia, the United States, England, and France don't always agree, and they can veto any action. So it becomes, well, there is almost never a police power. And to the extent there is one de facto, it is whoever is the most powerful country at that time in that circumstance and that place on that issue. So since 1945, obviously, clearly, the hegemon, the greatest, not in a value sense, but in an objective power sense, the greatest power on earth has been the United States. Now, the United States is not a saint and acts in its own self-interest, of course, but on most issues, the self-interest of the United States has been it has been decided that the United States self-interest is through collectively agreed upon action and regulation in most instances. And don't tire me by citing the near infinite number of instances when the United States hasn't done that, but overwhelmingly, on the whole, the U.S. has worked to foster obedience to the agreed upon norms. Absent that, nothing will happen. So on the specific issue of bribery, no question about it. If someone who provides women or men to prospective clients or lining pockets with envelopes full of money will have, in most cases, an advantage. But when there is somebody, to the extent possible, enforcing this, then that instance and those incidences decline. That is what has happened, but that is now, with the reduction in capability and absolute size and therefore capabilities of many American sources of power, and in a retreat of the commitment of the United States to these norms, bribery will go up, and the world will be a less regulated, less lawful place. No question about it.
And Russia is now the new best friend.
I'm sorry?
Russia is now the new best
Russia.
friend of the US.
Yeah, well, I wish that you and I had not been correct in our assessments on this, but we have been saying for years, and we're hardly the only ones, that the normative system that I just laboriously described is declining, and that in its place, Russia very clearly has been seeking to create a sphere of influence international system, and China a modified one. Or China actually is seeking to supplant the United States as the hegemon. They don't reject an international system so much, although their system is far more bilateral than multilateral. So it is a repudiation also. And that this is happening. Now, whether Trump, Patel, Gabbard, and so on are actually working, frankly, for the Russians or not, we can put aside and objectively affirm that the retreat of the United States by default accepts the creation of a sphere of influence system. And that means that might makes right where might is the strongest. So Russia will impose its will on Ukraine unless someone stops it. And China will impose its will on Tibet unless someone stops it, or Nepal, or Turkey will on the Kurds, etc.
So, as Thucydides said, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer as they must.
Yeah. Well, now you're pressing my buttons intentionally here because you know that I love Thucydides and history, but I read.
I like Thucydides as well.
Yeah, I've read Thucydides twice through. I've read it three times, but twice through. Once as a student, and then once as a professional adult in my late 40s. I think I was in my late 40s, and it literally moved me to tears. It's spending time with one of the great minds um, known to the 10,000 years of human civilization. And the only thing that has changed is that the Greeks had triremes, hundreds of men rowing a ship, and we have nuclear powered aircraft carriers. But otherwise, the motivations, the dynamics, the compromises, the incongruities and inconsistencies are of human behavior and incompatible but equally valid objectives are unchanged, and yeah, human nature is no different. So the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must, unless one has, imperfect as it may be, uh, people working to enforce a normative system, which is a state with laws, or an international system where there are agreements, which is a law that can be to some extent enforced.
Yeah, but to have a normative system globally, you have to have a normative system in a country. And at the moment, that itself is under threat from the sounds of it.
It
Doge
truly
doesn't
is
seem,
because
yeah,
it truly is because explicitly the framework of people who believe in the deep state. The deep state's one component of fascist conception of government and social dynamics, which is that by definition, the government is corrupt and evil against the people, and that only a leader can save the people and represent the people. All power to the leader. That is what the fascists said. Ein Volk, ein Führer, one person, one people, one leader. And it's what the Marxist Leninists have said, which is all power to the Soviets. And the Soviets was the faction that of Marxist Leninists that came to dominate power. And that bureaucracies are to be cowed, not strengthened as, and frankly, enforcers of uh, common will.
hang on a minute. The Soviet Union had a tremendous bureaucracy and they had regulations, some of it very well intentioned, for instance, to bring about equality between men and women. And so they weren't
Mhm.
exactly against bureaucracy. They, in fact, had too much of it. They were prescribing everything from
That's
the
true.
number
That's
of
true. Well,
eggs
they
everybody
that's
got to
true.
the size of condoms.
Yeah. Well, any individual or group that believes it knows the truth is going to be totalitarian, and but they have to have minions to exercise their will, and so they'll create endless bureaucracies, I suppose, to make sure that people don't think the wrong things.
Yeah, so going back to bureaucracy, and this is the final point. Doge is setting fire, as I said, to the federal bureaucracy. How constitutional or how legal are its methods? What do you think of the buyout everyone is being offered
Yeah.
from the CIA to every other government department you can think of, Department of Energy, Treasury, every place really. And
I think a lot. Yeah, I think a lot of it
and
probably is legal.
okay, and what are the implications? What happens 4 years from now? What happens 8 years from now? What happens a decade or two from now?
Yeah, well, reducing in size an institution is not necessarily bad, and issuing
CIA
executive
was cut
orders.
by 25% in the past, if I remember correctly from your article.
Yeah, I lived through, we call them RIFs, reduction in force, but there were mass firings of 25% of the workforce. It was a hecatomb. It was more than a hecatomb. A hecatomb was only 1/10. It was a quarter tome, to be silly. Um, and the effects were substantial. The capabilities of the institution dropped. Now, it's I think it's always true in any institution that one can achieve the same level of work with a certain reduction in force or budget to a certain degree. I don't know. I don't know the answer in the percentage terms, but 25% is a lot. It may be necessary and may be right to do. I don't dispute those who advocate reductions in force of federal bureaucracies as illegitimate in their intentions or objectives necessarily. I think in a good number of instances, in the current situation with Doge, much of this is being done. The polite term is extra legally, which means illegally. But there will be a large number of specific circumstances when, for organization X, the law allows certain executive behaviors, and institution Y it doesn't. So that's a hard thing to give a blanket answer to. My concern is that in the current circumstance, the reductions in force are not just seeking efficiencies, which one can disagree with or agree with and argue about, that's fine, but they're seeking to impose far beyond anything in history an orthodoxy and a will, and demonizing anyone who disagrees for any reason, so that it becomes a totalitarian rule by executive and fiat as opposed to a democratic regulatory system or state. And that doesn't just imply, that means the loss of individual freedom, and almost certainly means an increase in cronyism, inefficiency, which is the opposite of what's sought, except in obedience, and loss of democracy and individual rights. So that's profoundly, profoundly alarming. It means fundamentally, not, you can't even say potential anymore, the loss of American democracy, which is something that the license plates just north of me say one should live free or die. And so what is being presented as a restoration of freedom is actually its evisceration, which is more than frightening. It's infuriating, dangerous, and as what can one individual do? We all become the hapless and sometimes terribly doomed poor German soldier who's ordered to stand at a death camp.
Well, that is dramatic, but I hear from classicists who like their Roman references and Greek references that, hey, we've seen this before. American democracy was basically suffering from dysfunction. There's too much polarization. The arteries were clogging up. Legislation was impossible. Executive authority had increased. Even the judiciary had become dodgy, a bit too politically oriented. And what you're seeing is a strong man who comes and rescues a dysfunctional system. It's happened in Greece. Alexander appeared to create an empire. Julius Caesar, your great hero, appeared to create the Roman Empire. It existed before, after Julius, it was a different beast. And post-revolutionary France, which was in complete chaos, had its Napoleon. So could it be that the US, with all its problems and its dysfunctional democracy, might be under its own Julius Caesar?
Well, that's sort of the perspective of the supporters of Trumpism, of fascism. I do admire Caesar, but Caesar destroyed the Republic, corrupt as it was, and the empire was totalitarian. I mean, there's never been really a democracy until the United States, or possibly England. No, not possibly England prior to the United States. Napoleon, I think the British got right, was the butcher of Europe, and killed dozens of millions of people for his so that he could make his son and brother, emperor of Milan or whatever the heck it was. And he was
You
a
sound like
modernizer.
Edmund Burke now. You sound like a
I admire
conservative,
Edmund Burke
the father of
tremendously.
modern conservatism.
Yeah, well, which has nothing to do with what we're living now as opposed to conservatism at all. Um, so I don't agree that the various crises in American history um, have been the same nature as what we are experiencing now. There have always been strong elements of American society and the political system that are isolationist, totalitarian, regionalist, racist, xenophobic. But they have never,
Andrew
except in
Jackson
the
in the
South,
Trail of Tears. Andrew Jackson, a populist from the
sure.
Trail of
Well,
Tears.
happily, our definition of what constitutes a human being, someone with rights, has progressively expanded. That's one of the triumphs of the American experiment. So the genocide, it frankly was, of the Indians, which was viewed as acceptable because they weren't actually, they had no right to rights since they weren't like us. Those views um, have been discredited and rights have expanded. There hasn't been an instance in American history, except the South, the Confederacy from 1861 to 65, when um, the totalitarians or the racists actually ran everything. Now, at different times in history in the United States, everywhere, there have been different conceptions of what constitutes an acceptable in-group member. Um, so that before, Andrew Jackson did hideous things while promoting actually democratic practices for the in-group. Um, but our views have expanded, and the uh, attempt or the desire of the current group to restrict them again, I would argue, runs counter certainly to American history, certainly to American ideals, and is ill-suited to American circumstances of a multi-ethnic society, recognizing as the whole experiment of the West has attempted to do, the increasing um, rights of the individual against those of the state, while recognizing that there are shared obligations to others too.
Yeah, I mean, just very quickly, it is, to be fair to Donald Trump, it is a multiracial cabinet. It's not exactly a reversion to the Confederacy, and surely the Confederacy was all charming belles and handsome gentlemen. Haven't you seen Gone with the Wind?
I hate that movie, but yeah, the color of skin is less important even for conservatives. Uh, but the definition of what constitutes a just society and a fair functional government is not just different. I don't care about different. One can be against abortion or for it and be a supporter of democracy. One can be for low taxes and no regulations or in favor of them uh, without challenging the foundational practices and beliefs that make democracy possible. And fascistic characterizations of society and institutions is not compatible with a functioning democracy. And that's what we're experiencing. If I can, the last thing I'll say, because I don't think we've emphasized it at all, or certainly not enough in this moment. People can disagree on issues and even disagree about facts, but there are objective facts. And many of the premises taken as facts in this Project 2025 by its authors, by the intellectual architects of the Trump phenomenon, by Kash Patel and Tulsi Gabbard, are not just demonstrably, but are proven to be untrue. when the facts are clear and one persists in maintaining something untrue, that then becomes a lie. It may be a lie that the promoters of the lie believe, but it is an untruth and a lie, however sincerely held. And that is corrosive and dangerous. And when done willfully, corrupt. And that is the case with many of the assertions made by Kash Patel and Tulsi Gabbard, and even in Project 2025, therefore, by the Trump administration. And that is truly dangerous.
That note, Glenn, always a pleasure. Great chatting with you. And those of you who are watching this, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel and share it with your friends. And make sure you send us your thoughts. We'd love to publish them. Sign up and become a newsletter subscriber. We want more people reading us. And if you feel particularly generous, go and donate, become a regular donor. $11 a year is less than $1 a month. And it makes sure that a free press actually remains free instead of being owned by Jeff Bezos and having paywalls on top. Thank you, Glenn.
Okay.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.